stop slipping and stop cutting your socks. We have 15 different color options between 3 grip socks and 2 sleeve types. Something for everybody at a price that just makes sense. Available now at puregripsocks.com.
280, 160. What's the difference? Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to a pair of football boots that a lot of people have been asking for in the Adidas Predator 25 Pro FT, a mid-level Predator model now finally available with that iconic fold-over flap tongue, something that previously was only available at your top-end elite price point of $280 or your low-end budget-friendly price point of $100 in the League FT. However, the Predator Pro FT kind of slots somewhere in the middle of those two, bearing a retail price of $160, which is only $10 more than the non-FT variation of the Predator Pro, which doesn't make a lot of sense because the Elite FT bears a $20 premium over the non-FT variation, effectively proving that the prices of football boots in 2025 are just all completely made up. In other words, depending on which model you go for, you can either pay $10 more or $20 more for effectively the exact same tongue. Having said all that, while the Pro FT definitely looks the part, I think the big question here is, does this new model improve upon last year's Predator 24 Pro, which simply put is one of the worst fitting and most uncomfortable $150 football boots I've ever tried. Where of course we're gonna go over the good and the bad of the new Pro FT, but I can tell you right off the bat that I think it's a huge improvement over last year's Predator 24 Pro. Having said that, despite being $120 less and looking so similar to that top-end Elite model, these are unanimously considered very good. There are some pretty significant differences, and I would say more so quirks as it relates to fit, comfort, and certain features when comparing this first takedown model to the top end version. So before just going and pulling the trigger on a pair of Pro FTs because they look really cool and are a lot less expensive than the Elites, there are a couple things that you should probably know, which we're gonna cover in today's video, including how they fit and feel on feet. So if you're interested in learning more, please stick around, and if you are interested in a pair for yourself, you can pick them up below their normal retail price by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the first link down below. And as always, if you appreciate the unsponsored, brutally honest opinions on this channel, don't forget to drop a like on the video and make sure you're subscribed if you haven't already so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2024-25. 15 days in and I'm still getting the year wrong. So just like last year, if you were to simply go on the Adidas website and read the tech specs for the Predator 25 Pro FT, it would read very similar to that of the top-end Elite model with a hybrid touch upper, rubber strike skin elements, a fold-over flap held down by an elastic strap, and the exact same FG stud pattern. Therefore, why would anybody go and spend $280 on the Elite model when they can get the Pro for $120 less? Well, that's because tech specs can be very deceiving, because as we saw last year with the Predator 24 Pro and its hybrid touch upper and rubber strike skin elements, the fit and shaping of the football boot ruined all of that. You can have the best components, but if they don't come together to fit on your foot properly, then it all kind of goes out the window. Luckily, this new one fixes most of those issues. Where as you can see, because the upper is labeled, this Predator Pro is still made from that same hybrid touch material that you'll find on the top-end Elite model, and admittedly, it feels very, very similar. I'd make the argument that it's a smidge thicker, but not because the material is actually different, but more so the quality of the construction just isn't quite as nice. Where I think it's very noticeable when you have the Pro and the Elite in hand side by side, but if you just look at kind of the edge of the upper itself where it's cut to give you that opening, you can see how rough it's cut and the general thickness of the material, including the liner just along that edge. This is the Pro variation. And then if you look how cleanly it's done and how slightly thinner it is on the Elite model, that's really going to be the main difference in terms of the uppers on these two football boots. Yes, the Pro has all the same componentry, but it's put together in such a way that just, I don't necessarily want to say is cheap, but it's certainly cheaper and lower quality than what you get from the Elites. Does that build quality difference change the overall feel and performance characteristics of the boots? Not necessarily, but I would make the argument that certainly the Elite model does feel that more premium, and I do also prefer the way that it fits, but we'll talk about that more later in the video. Quality differences aside, the Hybrid Touch upper on this boot is still relatively thin and relatively firm in terms of its feel. So despite kind of a big fold over Predator giving you the impression that this is going to be a little bit of a bulkier, more padded feeling football boot, I would actually argue that the material gives a little bit more of a barefoot sensation than a lot of people would expect, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. They're certainly not as thin as a pair of F50s as an example, but they do have less padding and certainly less protection than I think a lot of people might anticipate. And then of course, you do also get those rubber strike skin elements, which again, from a quality perspective, you can see that these are made from a solid black rubber versus the rubber on the Elites that are just finished a lot more sharply and in kind of like a black translucent rubber, which just again, looks and feels that little bit more premium to the touch, but ultimately serves the same purpose in terms of this providing just as much grip as the more expensive variation. The difference here is going to be, however, that when you fold the tongue over, of course, you do see these little strips of what look like rubber and what are actually rubber on that top end Elite model, but on the Pro, they're just little painted in pieces of texture that provide no extra grip whatsoever. Not a big deal, but it is a difference when you're comparing it to the more expensive variation. Either way, whether you're passing or shooting, you're still going to get that extra bite from this rubber strike skin element that just allows the upper to grab the ball a little bit more easily and arguably more effectively than a pair of football boots without this additional grip. It's not necessarily going to make your shot more powerful or more accurate or even improve your ability to control the ball, but certainly when it comes to generating spin, it's going to do that a little bit more easily, which is something that I'm personally, from a feel perspective, a really big fan of. As far as the fold over tongue is concerned, it's not dissimilar to that of the Elites, but it is, again, kind of just a little bit lower quality. It's a really soft kind of microfiber material. You don't get the embroidery on the underside, but it is a nice soft microfiber all the way through with this more traditional U-throat construction and standalone tongue, which is a major difference coming from last year's Predator 24 Pro, which kind of had more of that one-piece upper construction that in combination with the super low volume, narrow shaping that boot had just did not feel good whatsoever. This, I'd argue, is a huge improvement. The lacing system runs nice and deep, allowing for good adjustability, not the best or even not as good as the Elites, but decent adjustability. And of course, you do also get that elastic strap to hold the tongue down that is pretty similar to that of the Elites. It's maybe a little bit stretchier and just generally less rugged feeling, but in terms of holding the tongue down, it certainly does the job. Moving to the rear, this is where, again, you're going to find a pretty significant difference coming from the Predator 24 Pro in that the construction has been completely redesigned to be a little bit more similar to that of the top-end model, where, of course, it's still a low-cut boot like the entirety of the Predator line. It extends a little bit higher at the very back, and you can see the lining material is actually quite thick and runs all the way along the side of the ankle. You have quite a fair amount of padding at the very back, and then it kind of just has this floating border along the edge that's made from a more structured, almost nylon mesh type material that at the end of the day, you don't really feel. It's just there to cover up that black liner from the side profile. As far as the liner itself is concerned, obviously plenty of padding. It's made from a really soft microfiber material, and because it has such nice padding to it, it does a good job of grabbing your heel. In terms of the depth of the heel, it's definitely way deeper fitting than last year's Predator 24 Pro. However, like a lot of Adidas takedown models, I would still argue that it's slightly on the shallower side, not to the point where it's detrimental to the feel, comfort, or experience of playing in these football boots, but I would personally like it to have fit a little bit deeper, more along the lines of what you get from the Elite. So that is, again, a pretty big difference. And generally, in terms of the rear area of the boot, I would say that this is a bulkier overall construction in terms of how it feels. You have that internal plastic heel counter as well as a major difference coming from the Elites, given that this is not the same control frame 2.0. And then the insole, fully removable. I'll give you guys a quick look at that. It's pretty much the same as the top end model. Mesh liner on top, some pretty fancy Predator graphics, and it's made from a single layer of this white foam. Where admittedly, like most football boot insoles, it's really nothing special, but it is also a lot nicer than what we've come to expect from Adidas takedown models. Which brings us to the base of the boot, where you're going to find the one carryover element from the Pred 24 Pro, in that it's a plastic sole plate design that, while it looks similar to that of the top end Elite model, it's a completely different plastic that admittedly is just stiffer pretty much all the way through. Not to the point where I necessarily think that it feels bad, but it's certainly a firmer, thicker feel than what you're going to get from that top end Elite model and its control frame 2.0 that is effectively an F50 sprint frame, if we're being honest with ourselves. So if you like a more solid underfoot feel, you might actually prefer this sole plate over the Elites, but I do think the Elite one in general just feels that little bit better. It certainly reduces the weight as well, which we'll take a look at in just a second. And then as far as the FG stud pattern is concerned, it's the same across the board, whether you buy high end or low end from the current Predator series. All triangular studs in what is kind of that classic layout from the Adidas brand that at this point everybody has tried at least once. Nothing groundbreaking as far as performance is concerned, but if you've worn an Adidas boot in the last 15 years or so and enjoyed the traction on offer, expect more of the same from the Predator Pro FT. And then there's the weight, where despite the Pro looking so similar, especially from a distance, to that of the Elite model, there is a pretty big difference in terms of how much they weigh. Both in the same size, 9.5 US. We'll start off with that top end Elite model, and you can see that they weigh in at 7.55 ounces, the equivalent of 214 grams, which is on the lighter side as far as high-end football boots go. You're kind of treading into speed boot territory, despite them really not looking or being marketed as speed boots. And then if we throw on the Pro variation, you can see that they weigh in at 10 ounces exactly, the equivalent of 284 grams, which for those doing the math at home is a 70 gram weight difference compared to the Elites, which is absolutely gigantic when it comes to modern day football boots, where you go from something that is very, very light to something that isn't unbearably heavy, but certainly has a heavier feel compared to almost anything else that you can buy at this price point. Again, for comparison's sake, just to give you a little bit of an idea of how much these weigh, in the same size, they're pretty much the same as a pair of classic Copa Mundials. On feet, the difference is night and day compared to last year. It's a huge improvement. However, when you're comparing the overall fit and comfort to that top-end Elite model, where granted they do cost $120 more than these, it must be said that the shaping is still on the lower volume, narrower side compared to the Elites, which is not necessarily a bad thing if you want your Predators to fit super, super tight. But if that's not necessarily your cup of tea or what you would expect from a football boot with an old school fold over flap tongue, you might be a little bit disappointed with the Pred 25 Pro, where it's pretty difficult for me to show you the shaping and volume differences when compared to the Elites. It's not really until you get the opportunity to try the Pros on feet, especially if you can try them with the Elites as well, that you really can see and feel how much of a difference there actually is, where I'm not trying to suggest that these are an uncomfortable pair of football boots, but again, they are going to fit a lot tighter and just generally more narrow and more shallow than all the other variations of the Preds, whether it's the Elites or the Leagues. They just have a little bit of a quirky fit. Beyond the obvious differences in the shaping, the heel construction is also quite a bit different from the Elites in that, again, it's just bulkier and also slightly more shallow, but at the end of the day, does lock your foot in place quite nicely, and once you get used to it, it's not really a big deal at all. And then the sole plate, like I mentioned, is noticeably thicker and stiffer than what you're going to find from that Elite, which may or may not be a good thing depending on personal preference. Not to mention, these don't really feel particularly lightweight, which is something that I don't think people buying a pair of Predators are necessarily looking for. But if you're spending $160 on a pair of football boots in 2025, I think the expectation would be that they'd be a little bit lighter than these are. Like I said, from a width perspective, if you have wide feet, these are not going to be a good option. In particular, if you like having just a little bit of extra wiggle room in your boots at all, these also probably wouldn't be a great option. The low volume, shallow fit that they have pretty much all the way through makes them feel a little bit more like a pair of speed boots in terms of how they wrap your foot versus a pair of Predators. Not to say that the Elites also don't have a snug overall fit. They're certainly not the widest boots in the world, but these, like I said, are not a great option if you need extra width or volume of any kind. And as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So if you are looking to get a pair, I would strongly recommend going true to size. Of course, there is the argument that you could go half a size up to buy yourself a little bit of extra space. But if that in turn leaves you with extra space at the end of your toe just to accommodate a little bit of extra width, I would personally argue that they're just not the right boots for you from a fit perspective. But that again is very much down to personal preference. So in conclusion, I actually think the Pred 25 Pro FT is a decent pair of football boots and certainly a gigantic improvement over the disaster that was the Pred 24 Pro from last year. But can I honestly say that I think the Pro is the perfect alternative to the more expensive Elite model if you're on a bit of a budget? For the vast majority, I don't think that's the case. If you're counting the hybrid touch upper, the rubber strike skin elements, and the fold over flap tongue as the three defining features that make up this modern Predator recipe, then yes, you're getting all of that with the Pred 25 Pro FT. However, from a fit and comfort perspective, that lower volume, narrower shaping compared to the Elite model simply is not going to work well for everybody. Not that the Elites are particularly wide as it is, but if you need some extra width in your football boots, then I can assure you that the Pro is not going to be a comfortable fit. Where don't get me wrong, it's nowhere near as bad as last year, and if they fit you, I think the Pro 25 FT will be a comfortable football boot experience for you, but this really does feel like one of those situations where they almost made the shape a little bit weird on purpose to have more separation between the Pro and the Elite. Had the Pro been the exact same shape as the Elite model or something a little bit closer from a width and volume perspective, then I think this would have been an easier recommendation if, again, you could live with that extra 70 grams of weight, which certainly isn't insignificant. To make a long story short, if you can live with the extra weight and you have the opportunity to try them on and they happen to fit your feet quite well, I think the Predator 25 Pro FT is a solid pair of football boots, but still not anywhere near as good as the Elites, despite being so similar on paper.